In this video, we're going to talk about quadratic equations. So in our last few videos, we talked about what a linear equation was and what an equation was in general. So an equation is where you have one expression and you have another expression, and you're saying that those two expressions are equal to each other. And so if you recall, an expression is just a combination of variables and constants. So the difference between any equation and a quadratic equation is a quadratic equation has to be of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are just constant coefficients and your variables would just be x. And so you notice that a quadratic equation has this ax squared term. This part is the foundation of a quadratic equation. So if you don't have this term, then it's not a quadratic equation. You don't have to have the bx or the c terms because you could just have b equals 0 or c equals 0. And so whenever you have an equation of this form, where a, b, and c are constants, then you know it's a quadratic equation. So there are a few ways you can solve quadratic equations. A first method would be to factor. And so in many scenarios, you're able to factor a quadratic equation, and by doing so, you're able to easily solve the solutions. And so we'll look more into that in the next video. You could also complete the square. Now this is less common simply because a lot of people are, I guess, scared by the topic. It's actually not too bad of a topic when you boil it down deeply. And so it's a very effective method for finding the solutions of a quadratic equation when you cannot factor. And a third method would be to use the quadratic formula. So if you recall from Algebra 1, the quadratic formula is just the crazy looking formula where you have x equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so this formula is just a handy way of finding the solutions for a quadratic equation when you can't factor or you have a calculator with you and completing the square would be a longer method. So the best method always is to factor, and then you can either choose to complete the square or use this quadratic formula. Now if you can't do any of those steps, what you want to do is simplify, because there might be an extra few steps that you need to do in order to combine terms or rearrange terms, just so that you can have a quadratic equation be in its simplest form. And so a lot of people overlook this step, but it's very important to recognize that you have to simplify in some scenarios. And so now let's look at some special scenarios regarding quadratic equations. So there are a few that we're going to talk about. The first scenario is where x squared equals p. So basically p is just a constant number, so you could have x squared equals 4 or x squared equals 6. So I'll just write those. So i.e. x squared equals 4. And the way to solve for x is by taking the square root of both sides. So when you have the square root of x squared equals the square root of p, you know that x equals plus or minus the square root of p, right? Because when you take the square root of p, you just have the square root of p. And you have to recognize that you need plus or minus, because if x equaled negative square root of p, when you square that out, it's still positive p. So it's important to know that you need to have x equals both plus and minus square root of p. So this is the first scenario. A second scenario would be when you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And so one sub-scenario would be where b squared minus 4ac. And so we call this the determinant, right? This is basically where you take the coefficients and you match them up, and so you calculate them. So b, you square this, and then you subtract 4 times this times this. And so those are all going to be constant numbers. If this is greater than 0, then we know that there are two distinct real solutions. What this means is they're going to be two different solutions, and both of the solutions are real, so they're not imaginary. And imaginary is basically where you take the square root of -1, for example. A second sub-scenario would be where b squared minus 4ac equals 0. And by doing this, if you have the determinant, which is b squared minus 4ac, if that equals 0, then you know there's only one real solution. So because you're going to have the same solution twice, because whenever you have this, you know that your quadratic equation is a perfect square. And the final scenario would be where b squared minus 4ac is less than 0. And in this scenario, you're not going to have any real solutions. So no real solutions. You'll have two complex solutions, but don't worry too much about that, as you're not going to need to know that too much in Algebra 2. So this is the second scenario where you have to take the determinant, which is once again b squared minus 4ac, so that's going to be a number because you just put in the coefficients. And you have to look at these three scenarios where if it's greater than 0, you have two distinct real solutions. If it equals 0, you only have one real solution. Or if it's less than 0, where you don't have any real solutions. And so these are the two key special scenarios that you have to look at. Now, the latter isn't really a special scenario, but it's just kind of a trick that you can use to see how many solutions a quadratic equation has. So this is especially important whenever you have b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, because in that case you'll know that you cannot factor or complete the square or use the quadratic formula, because then your solutions will be imaginary and or complex. So hopefully you learned a lot from this video. Let me know if you have any suggestions, and thanks for watching.